They say Christmas is a time for family, for joy, for remembering the love that holds us together. But what happens when the one person you gave everything to, your whole life, your heart, your sacrifices, looks you in the eye on the most sacred day of the year and makes you feel like you mean nothing at all? What happens when your own child, the very person you raised alone with blistered hands and sleepless nights, turns around and humiliates you in front of people you once considered family? My name is Helen, and I never imagined that one Christmas would change the course of my life. I never thought I'd be standing on my son's porch, holding the deed to his house in my hand the morning after he disrespected me. But I did. And not out of spite, but out of heartbreak, reclaiming something far more important than bricks and wood. If you've ever loved someone so much that losing their respect felt like losing yourself, then this story is for you. And by the time you reach the end, maybe you'll understand why I did what I did, not to hurt him, but to finally heal myself. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow had begun to fall in soft sheets across the front lawn, dusting the porch steps with a fresh coat of white that reminded me of the way powdered sugar used to cling to the tops of the cookies I once baked for Ethan when he was little. Back then, he would run around the house with flour streaked on his cheeks and a half-eaten gingerbread man in one hand, laughing, spinning, calling me Mama, in that sweet high-pitched voice that could melt any burden I carried. But those days had long since passed, and as I stood alone in my kitchen stirring gravy with a wooden spoon that had seen better days, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the house had become, how cold, how foreign, despite all the festive decorations I had forced myself to hang, garlands, lights, even the crocheted stockings I had made when he was in kindergarten, each one stitched with love during the night shifts I took as a hospital janitor to keep food on our table and heat in our tiny apartment. And now, after years of sacrifice, after giving up my own dreams, turning down job offers, dating chances, and every personal ambition I once had so that I could be there for my son, so I could make sure he never felt the sting of abandonment like I did growing up, here I was preparing Christmas dinner alone again because although Ethan had promised me he'd come early and help set the table, he texted me just an hour before saying he'd be late, that Alana's parents were throwing a brunch and she really wanted him there. And just like that, I became optional. I wasn't angry at first, just hurt. But I told myself not to take it personally, that kids grow up and start lives of their own, that maybe I was being too sensitive, too old-fashioned, but the ache in my chest told me otherwise. It whispered of a loneliness I had refused to acknowledge for years, a loneliness made sharper by the memories of past Christmases when Ethan would leap into my arms first thing in the morning, dragging me toward the little tree we could barely afford, squealing at the sight of wrapped boxes even if they only contained second-hand toys I had scrubbed clean and wrapped with pages from the newspaper. He never cared about the cost, just the thought, and he'd always say, "Best Christmas ever, Mama." And I'd feel like I had done something right, like all the missed meals, the worn-out shoes, the nights spent worrying about bills were worth it. But now, as I placed the ham in the oven and adjusted the thermostat to save on heating, I realized that version of Ethan, the sweet, grateful boy who once gave me a hand-drawn picture of a superhero labeled my mom, had been replaced by someone I hardly recognized, someone distant, dismissive, and worst of all, ashamed of me. The dinner was ready by 6 and he still hadn't arrived. Alana's parents, who lived in a sprawling suburban mansion with marble floors and a chandelier in the foyer, had apparently extended their brunch well into the evening. And when Ethan finally showed up at 8:30, smelling of wine and expensive cologne, he barely glanced at the meal I had spent 2 days preparing, and instead of the warm hug I had been hoping for, he gave me a cold, distracted "hey," followed by a complaint about how tight the driveway was with the snow, then kissed Alana on the cheek and sat down on the couch, pulling out his phone as if I wasn't even there. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to cry or scream, and instead I did neither. I just quietly lit the candles on the table and called them to eat. But even then, Ethan made a joke about how old-fashioned I was, saying, "Mom, no one does candlelit dinners anymore." And Alana giggled like it was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard, her eyes sweeping over my thrifted tablecloth and chipped plates like she was in some kind of parody of a poor person's Christmas. My face burned, but I swallowed it down because that's what mothers do, right? We swallow the pain, we bite our tongues, we serve the damn ham and hope they notice the love baked into every bite. But Ethan barely touched his plate, and Alana kept talking about how her parents were flying them to Aspen for New Year's, how they might upgrade the kitchen in the house I had helped him buy. Yes, me, the same woman who had cashed out her only savings, the emergency fund I'd been building for retirement, so he could afford a down payment because he said the bank wouldn't. approve him alone, and he just needed a little help. I gave it to him gladly because that's what love does, it gives without counting. But that night, as he talked about tearing down the walls of the kitchen I once helped paint, I realized I was no longer a part of his story, just a footnote, a stepping stone, a relic of a life he was trying to leave behind. The final blow came when I handed him a small wrapped box. Inside was a framed photograph of us from his high school graduation, a moment I had cherished, holding him in my arms as tears streamed down both our faces. And he opened it, looked at it for less than a second, then said, "Oh, you still keep these old pictures?" Before setting it down like it was meaningless, like I was meaningless. And I knew in that moment, with the clarity that only heartbreak can bring, that something had broken between us, something sacred and irreparable. And while they laughed at a joke I didn't understand, I quietly stood up, walked into the kitchen, and let the tears fall where no one could see, my hands clutching the edge of the sink like it could anchor me, like it could hold together the pieces of a heart that had just shattered. Because no one tells you that the deepest betrayals don't come from enemies or strangers. They come from the ones you raised, the ones you loved more than life itself. And as I stood there surrounded by the scent of rosemary and pine, I realized this Christmas wasn't about joy or peace or family. It was about loss, the loss of a connection I had fought so hard to keep alive. And in that moment I made a silent vow, not out of anger but out of necessity, that this would be the last time I let someone, even my own son, make me feel small in my own home. The silence that filled the house that night after they left was unlike any I had ever known. It wasn't just the absence of voices or footsteps or laughter, it was the silence of a heart breaking in slow motion, the silence of a mother sitting alone in her dimly lit kitchen, her hands still trembling from the weight of memories that felt heavier than any insult ever could. And as I sat there, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock the only sounds accompanying me, my mind drifted back through the years like flipping through pages of a photo album worn thin with time, and I found myself staring out the frosted window, watching snowflakes fall and remembering another Christmas, nearly 25 years ago when I brought Ethan home from the hospital wrapped in a blue knit blanket my sister had sent from out of state. It was just the two of us back then, me and a baby I wasn't sure I was ready for. The result of a short-lived relationship with a man who vanished the moment he heard the word pregnant, leaving me alone at 22 with no degree, no savings and no family close by, just a one-bedroom apartment that smelled of mildew and the constant thrum of desperation that came with counting every dime. But when I held Ethan in my arms that first night, his tiny fingers curling around mine like he already knew I needed him as much as he needed me, I made a promise to myself that no matter how hard life got, I would give him everything. I would be both mother and father, protector and provider, dreamer and realist, and somehow I did just that, working double shifts at the diner during the day and cleaning offices at night, sleeping in fits on the pull-out couch while he rested in a crib beside me that I bought secondhand from a neighbor after selling my microwave. And I remember those early years as a blur of exhaustion and determination, of feeding him formula while scribbling grocery lists on napkins, of fixing his lunch before school and tying his shoes with shaking hands after long nights mopping floors. And though we had so little, he always smiled. He smiled with the kind of light that made my worst days worth surviving. And when he'd wrap his little arms around my neck and whisper, "You're my hero, Mama," I felt stronger than I ever imagined I could be. Every school play, every doctor's visit, every scraped knee and spelling test was a battlefield I crossed for him, never letting him see the cracks forming inside me. Never letting him see the bills piling up on the kitchen counter, or the eviction notices I managed to talk my way out of, or the jobs I lost because I had to leave early when he got sick. He never knew about the days I went without eating so he could have seconds, or the Christmas when I pawned my wedding ring not out of sentiment but necessity, to buy him a winter coat and a toy fire truck he'd been begging for. And I remember how his eyes lit up when he unwrapped it, how he ran in circles pretending to be a firefighter. And I told myself right then that all the struggle was worth it if he could just keep that joy in his heart. Time has a way of eroding innocence, both his and mine, and as he grew older and more aware of the world I started to notice changes in him. Subtle at first, like the way he stopped holding my hand in public or how he rolled his eyes when I hugged him in front of his friends. And though I knew it was part of growing up, part of asserting independence, I felt each small distance like a splinter under my skin, never big enough to remove but always there, always aching. High school brought more distance, especially after he met Alana, who came from a wealthier family and had a way of making everything I did feel inadequate. She once told Ethan in front of me that it was Cute, how his mom still packed his lunch like it was some kind of backwoods quirk, and though Ethan laughed it off, I saw the way he looked at me afterward, embarrassed, like I was something he needed to grow out of, not someone who had built his entire world brick by brick. And yet, despite the cracks, I kept giving, kept loving, kept sacrificing, even when it meant emptying my savings to help with his college tuition because the scholarship didn't cover housing, and even when he switched majors 3 times and I had to take out a personal loan just to keep him enrolled. I never questioned it, never resented it, because love, real love, doesn't keep score, it just keeps showing up. But looking back now, I realize how blind I was, how willing I was to trade pieces of myself for slivers of his approval, how I mistook his dependence for connection and his silence for stability. And somewhere along the way I stopped being a mother and became a shadow, someone he only called when he needed money or advice or help moving, and I answered every time, heart leaping at the sound of his voice, foolishly believing it meant something, that I still mattered. The hardest part wasn't the disrespect on Christmas night, it was the realization that it wasn't new, that it had been building slowly over years, layered beneath polite smiles and rushed phone calls and missed birthdays. And as I sat alone in that kitchen replaying every moment of our past like a movie I couldn't stop watching, I saw all the signs I had ignored, all the moments I should have said no, should have stood up for myself but didn't because I was so afraid of losing him, so afraid of becoming irrelevant, that I let him chip away at my dignity until there was barely anything left to protect. And that night, for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of that grief, not just for what had happened, but for all the years I had lost trying to hold on to a version of Ethan that no longer existed, and perhaps never truly had. The morning after Christmas, I woke to the dim gray light of winter seeping through the curtains, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards that creaked softly under my feet as I walked through the silence of my home, a home that felt like a mausoleum of memories now, and every step I took seemed to echo with reminders of a joy that had once lived here but now felt suffocated beneath the weight of last night's heartbreak. I didn't hear from Ethan. Not a call, not a message, not even a half-hearted apology to explain away the cutting words or the way he had made me feel like an inconvenience in my own house. And as I sat by the window with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the snow blanket the world in white, I couldn't help but feel like I had vanished. Like I was invisible to the one person who used to run into my arms like I was the center of his universe. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not the disrespect itself, but the absence that followed, the total lack of acknowledgement, as though nothing had happened, as though my feelings were so small they weren't even worth a text. And I spent that entire day walking through rooms we had once danced in during his childhood, passing by the piano we couldn't afford lessons for, and the hallway where I had marked his height on the wall each year, watching it climb like my hopes, higher and higher, until it reached the point where he stopped growing and I started shrinking. Not in size but in importance, in relevance, in the story of his life. And still, even then, I told myself maybe he just needed time, maybe he was embarrassed or didn't know how to apologize, because the heart of a mother will always search for excuses to shield her child from blame, even when it hurts her to do so. And that night I reheated leftovers and wrapped them carefully, thinking maybe he'd stop by the next day to pick them up. Maybe he'd remember how I used to sneak extra servings into his lunchbox or surprise him with his favorite pie on rough days. But the next day came and went, and the next, and with each one, my phone remained silent while the ache in my chest grew louder, a hollow thud that followed me into every room like a ghost of all the love I had given so freely, so unconditionally. I tried calling him once, just once, 3 days later, telling myself it was just to check in, just to ask how he was doing after the holiday, but when it rang 4 times and went to voicemail, I heard his recorded voice, calm, casual, detached, and I couldn't bring myself to leave a message because what was I going to say? Hi honey, just wanted to know why you treated me like a stranger on Christmas? Or, hey, do you even care that you broke my heart? No, instead I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor like it might offer answers, wondering how we had gotten here, how the boy who used to draw me cards that said, "You're the best mom in the world," had become a man who couldn't be bothered to look me in the eye. And over the next week, the silence stretched like an unwelcome guest, long and suffocating, and every small thing reminded me of him. The coat he left hanging by the door, the cup he used for cocoa, the scarf I had knitted for him last winter still lying folded on the back of the chair where he tossed it. And I started to feel foolish, like maybe I had imagined the bond between us, like maybe I had built our entire relationship on moments that meant more to me than they ever did to him. And that realization gutted me more than any insult could, because it made me question every memory, every sacrifice, every decision I had made with him in mind. I ran into Alana's mother at the grocery store that week. She was in the produce section dressed in her usual winter chic, and when she saw me her smile was tight, polite, the kind of smile people give when they feel obligated, not genuine, and she said something like, "Oh, I heard Christmas was lovely at your place. Ethan mentioned you made that same ham again, so sweet." And I stood there frozen, clutching a bag of carrots like a lifeline, realizing that not only had he told them about my food, but probably about my house, my traditions, my old-fashioned ways, and the way she said "so sweet" made it sound like pity, like I was a relic of a simpler, sadder time, something quaint and outdated, and I forced a smile, made some excuse about needing to rush, and left the store with a heart full of shame and a head full of spiraling thoughts that followed me all the way home, where I sat in the driveway for nearly an hour before going inside, afraid of the emptiness that waited behind the front door, afraid of what silence would tell me. If I listened too closely, it was during one of those nights, maybe the 6th or 7th after Christmas, that I pulled out an old photo album, one I hadn't opened in years, and began flipping through the pages. Ethan's first steps, his first birthday, the Halloween costume I stayed up all night sewing by hand, the science fair where he stood beaming beside a volcano we built together, the graduation ceremony where he hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. And with each picture I felt like I was looking at someone else's life, someone else's child, because the man who sat on my couch that Christmas Eve with his expensive coat and detached stare felt so far from that little boy that I began to wonder if I had done something terribly wrong along the way, if I had loved too much, given too much, protected too much, and in doing so, made him forget how to appreciate anything. And then, on the 9th day, a small envelope arrived in the mail. It was from the mortgage company. Routine update, I assumed, until I read the contents and my hands began to shake, because tucked inside was a line that didn't make sense. As requested, we are initiating the property reassessment to reflect the new ownership structure effective January 15th. And my breath caught in my throat as I read it again and again, trying to make sense of the words, until a cold dread settled over me and I realized this silence, this distance, this dismissal. Maybe it wasn't just emotional, maybe something deeper was happening, something I hadn't been told, and suddenly, the cold shoulder Ethan had given me on Christmas wasn't just hurtful, it was suspicious, and a question began to form in my mind that I didn't want to ask but couldn't ignore. What exactly had Ethan done with the house I helped him buy? When I finally gathered the courage to confront Ethan about the envelope, I didn't storm over or send an angry text. I simply called, just like I used to when he was away at college and hadn't checked in for days, with hope quietly stitched into every ring. But this time when he answered, there was a hesitation in his voice, a guarded pause that spoke volumes before he even said hello, and I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me more than the wind howling outside my window, that he had been keeping something from me, something big, and the tone he used, casual, distracted, a little irritated, was the same one he used when I used to remind him to do laundry or call his grandmother, and it was that tone more than the words that made me feel like I had stepped outside of his circle, like I was no longer someone he respected or valued, just a nagging obligation he hadn't figured out how to avoid entirely. I mentioned the letter gently, not accusingly, asking if he knew what it was about, and there was a pause followed by a sigh, and then he said, "Yeah, I meant to tell you, it's just some paperwork Alana's dad helped us with. We're trying to streamline some things with the house." And when I asked what he meant by streamline, he brushed it off with phrases like, "just legal stuff, and nothing you need to worry about." And that's when the knot began to form in my stomach, the tight, nauseating kind that mothers feel when they know their child is lying, and I pressed again, asking if the ownership of the house was changing, reminding him gently that my name was still on the deed, and the line went quiet for a long beat before he said something that sliced through me like ice. "Mom, I'm an adult now. I don't need you in every financial decision I make." And the way he said it, dismissive and cold, made it clear that whatever bond we had once shared had thinned into something brittle and breakable, and I hung up the phone not with anger, but with a grief so deep it made my hands tremble and my heart ache in a way that felt physical, because it wasn't just that he had changed, it was that he had chosen to hide it from me, to exclude me from something I had helped him build, and in that exclusion, I saw the final unraveling of the love I had once believed was unshakable. Over the following days, my mind became a storm of doubt and pain. I remembered how just 2 years ago he had called me in the middle of the night, panicked and lost, when Alana had briefly left him and I had stayed on the phone for hours, talking him through his tears, reminding him of his worth, helping him find the words to fix it, and now that same boy, my boy, was treating me like a burden, like a forgotten obligation, like the ghost of a life he was trying to bury beneath glossy kitchen remodels and brunches. With people who never saw me scrub floors until my hands cracked or walk miles to work in cheap shoes so he could have lunch money. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the past began to reshape itself in my memory. Every moment I had chalked up to stress or youth or immaturity now felt like warning signs I had ignored, like the way he used to forget to pay me back when I covered his rent, or how he rolled his eyes when I brought up budgeting, or the way he once said, "Alana's parents never talk about money," as though that made them superior, and each of those memories now struck me as another stitch in the unraveling thread of our bond, a bond one had poured everything into, only to realize he had been loosening it from his side for years. The worst part wasn't just feeling betrayed, it was realizing that I had been complicit in my own erasure, that I had given so much of myself so freely, so eagerly, that I had made it easy for him to forget I was ever necessary, and I found myself replaying our entire relationship, trying to pinpoint when exactly I stopped being his mother and started being the woman he tolerated, and in that relentless review, I started to feel something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Shame, deep and burning, not because of anything I had done wrong, but because I had allowed my love to become so one-sided, so all-consuming, that it no longer commanded respect, and with that realization came another. If I didn't draw a line, if I didn't reclaim my worth, I would disappear entirely from his life, not because he hated me, but because he had been trained, perhaps unknowingly, to believe that I would always be there, no matter how far he pushed me to the edges. And that fractured bond, once our most sacred connection, now felt like a lifeline that had snapped in the middle of a storm, and I was left clutching the broken ends, staring at the space where my son used to be, wondering if he'd ever feel the emptiness I now carried in my chest. Like a second heartbeat. It was a Wednesday afternoon, unusually warm for January, when I found myself in the attic. Not because I was looking for anything in particular, but because I needed space from the heaviness downstairs, from the scent of unopened leftovers and the silence that had grown thick in every corner of the house like a fog I couldn't clear. And something about the attic, with its wooden beams and smell of old dust and insulation, always reminded me of simpler times back when Ethan was little and we used to sit up there sifting through Christmas decorations or digging out baby clothes I refused to part with. And as I climbed the narrow staircase, my body still aching from sleepless nights and the emotional strain of being ignored by the one person I had given my whole life to, I wasn't expecting anything more than a quiet place to breathe. But fate, as I've learned, has a cruel way of showing you the truth when you're least prepared to see it. And that day, in the far corner behind an old chest of linens, I noticed a banker's box I didn't recognize, newer than the rest, with a fresh white label that read simply, "House Docs," in Ethan's handwriting. And though I hesitated for a moment, because deep down I think I already knew whatever was inside would change everything, I reached for it with trembling fingers, pulling it toward me and opening the lid to reveal a stack of neatly arranged folders, and as I began to flip through them, my heart picked up pace, first with confusion, then with growing dread, because inside were printed emails, property forms and signed agreements, some dating back months, that outlined the transfer of ownership for the very house I had helped him buy, the house I had invested not just money but memory into. And with each document I read, the truth became clearer. Ethan had been preparing to sell the house, my house, behind my back, and not only that, but he had been working with Alana's father and a legal team to remove me entirely from the deed. Using a quiet title claim, something I barely understood but knew enough about to realize it meant erasing my name, my contribution, my sacrifices from the legal history of the home as if I had never existed in its story. And I sat there, hunched over those papers, my breath shallow, my hands numb, and the realization swept over me like a tidal wave of betrayal, knocking the air from my lungs, because this wasn't just a financial move, it was a personal one, a deliberate, premeditated decision. To cut me out, to treat me not as a partner or a parent or even a human being, but as a liability. And what devastated me most wasn't just the act itself. It was the coldness with which it was carried out, the impersonal legal jargon, the careful removal of my name like erasing pencil marks from a page. And I thought back to the way Ethan had acted on Christmas, the way he downplayed my presence, the way he looked past me like I was furniture, and I realized this had been in motion even then. That his indifference wasn't just emotional distance. It was strategic. a necessary detachment to justify what he was doing. And as I flipped through more documents, I found handwritten notes, lists of things to update before listing, references to staging the kitchen, even a note about removing the old family photos, which meant he had planned not only to sell the house, but to make sure no trace of me was visible when strangers walked through. And something inside me broke, not with rage but with heartbreak so profound it felt like a physical wound, and I began to cry, not the quiet, dignified kind, but the kind that comes from the deepest place, the kind that makes your whole body tremble and your voice catch in your throat. And I cried for the girl I used to be, who gave up everything to raise a son who would one day erase her, and I cried for the mother who stayed up late worrying about grades and girlfriends and heartbreaks, who always picked up the phone, who never said no when it came to helping him chase his dreams. And I cried for the woman I had become, one who had lost herself in her love for someone who saw that love as disposable. And somewhere in the middle of that breakdown something shifted in me, something fundamental, because I realized I couldn't go on like this, couldn't keep allowing myself to be hurt and then waiting for apologies that never came. And it was then, sitting on the cold attic floor surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal, that I made a decision. Not out of vengeance but out of survival, out of the need to reclaim the parts of myself I had given away so freely. And I stood up, wiped my face, and carried that box downstairs with me, each step echoing like a drumbeat of resolution, because now for the first time in my life I wasn't going to ask for respect. I was going to demand it, and not with words, but with action, with a plan that would remind my son not just who I was, but what I was capable of. And as I set that box on the dining room table and stared down at the paperwork, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this betrayal wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I stopped being the background character in Ethan's life and started being the author of my own. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions, like standing in the middle of a storm with my feet in quicksand. Part of me wanted to scream, to confront Ethan with every page from that box and demand answers, demand respect, demand to know how he could be so calculating, so cold. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the way his tiny hand used to fit inside mine, the way he used to crawl into my bed after nightmares and whisper, "Don't worry, Mama, I'll protect you." That part of me felt paralyzed, trapped between heartbreak and disbelief, because no matter how much those documents confirmed the truth, no part of my soul wanted to believe that my son, could see me as expendable. And that division within me, that tearing between motherly instinct and the raw need for justice, it consumed me in the quiet hours. Especially at night when the house was still and the only sound was the whisper of the wind pushing against the windows, and I would sit on the edge of the bed holding one of Ethan's childhood toys, a little stuffed bear he used to carry everywhere, and I would press it to my chest as if I could somehow breathe back the boy who once loved me without condition. But the truth was, that boy had grown into a man I didn't recognize, a man who had been molded not just by the world but by the choices I made, the sacrifices I kept hidden, the way I always stepped back to let him shine. And in doing so, perhaps I had taught him that my presence was constant, my love guaranteed, my forgiveness automatic. And so I began to look inward, not out of guilt but necessity, because if I didn't understand how we got here, I knew I would never find a way forward. So I started writing letters to myself, not ones I intended to send or show anyone, but raw, unfiltered thoughts on crumpled sheets of paper that I shoved into a drawer each night. And in those letters I poured out everything. The joy, the fear, the regret, the pride, the confusion. And through those words I began to see the outlines of a woman I had long forgotten. A woman who had dreams once, who wanted to travel, to paint, to open a bakery, who laughed too loudly and danced barefoot in the kitchen before the bills, and the loneliness turned her laughter into silence and her dance into a steady shuffle from room to room. And somewhere in those reflections I realized that Ethan wasn't the only one who had changed. I had too, not just over time, but through 1,000 tiny decisions to put myself last, to pour out my cup for him until there was nothing left. And while that kind of love might sound noble, I could see now how dangerous it had become, how it had taught him that I was a resource, not a person, and that realization broke me all over again, because I had done it in the name of love. And yet here I was, watching that love turn to ash in my hands. But grief, as suffocating as it is, can sometimes carve out space for clarity, and once the shock faded, a fierce calm settled over me, the kind that follows a storm when the sky opens up and you can see the horizon again. And I knew I had to speak to someone who wouldn't dismiss me or patronize me, someone who remembered the younger version of me. So I called my oldest friend, Teresa, who I hadn't spoken to in months, not out of neglect but out of the way life pulls you in different directions. And the moment she heard my voice, thick with emotion, she didn't ask questions, she just said, "Come over." And within the hour I was sitting in her living room with a cup of tea and tears streaming down my face as I told her everything, every word, every document, every aching fear that maybe I had failed as a mother. And she listened, not with pity but with fire in her eyes, and when I finished she leaned forward, took my hands and said, "You didn't fail him, Helen. You protected him, you raised him, you gave him everything. But now it's time you protect yourself." And that sentence, that simple truth, hit me like a lightning bolt because it was the first time anyone had ever given me permission to put myself first, and something about the way she said it, firm, unwavering, unlocked a door in me that I hadn't realized was shut. And over the next few days I started to change, not in dramatic ways but in small, deliberate steps. I canceled the weekly grocery drop-off I had been sending to Ethan's house. I called the mortgage office to schedule a meeting with a lawyer about the deed, and I started waking up early not to cook or clean, but to sit by the window with a notebook and write down what I wanted, who I wanted to be, what I had buried beneath decades of motherhood. And through that process I began to see that my identity didn't have to end with mom, that maybe I could still become someone new, someone whole, someone strong. And yet, even as I rebuilt myself brick by brick, there was still that ache in my chest, that fracture that wouldn't heal, and I knew it wouldn't go away until I faced Ethan. Not in rage but in truth, because somewhere deep inside, beneath all the disappointment and anger, I still loved him, still saw the little boy in his eyes, and I knew that before I could move forward, I needed to confront him, not just for closure, but to give him one last chance to see me, not as the doormat he could walk over, but as the mother who had carried him through storms he never knew about, and who had finally learned to stand in her own light. The morning I woke up with the decision solidified in my heart was like no other. There was no dramatic sunrise, no external sign that the world had shifted, but inside me, something had locked into place, a sense of purpose that felt heavier than grief and sharper than anger. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with the box of documents spread before me, each page now no longer just evidence of betrayal but building blocks for something greater, something necessary. And for the first time in weeks I didn't cry when I looked at those papers. Instead, I studied them with the eyes of a woman who had spent her entire life surviving, and now, finally, was ready to thrive on her own terms. I began making calls, starting with the county clerk's office to get a copy of the original deed, then to a legal aid service Teresa had recommended, and when I told the paralegal my story, there was a brief silence on the line before. She said, "You still have more control than you think." And those words became the heartbeat of the days that followed as I consulted with a real estate attorney who explained that because my name remained on the deed and the financial history of the home was traceable to my bank account, no transfer could be legally completed without my consent. And when he said, "You're not powerless here," something in me rose like a tide that had been held back for too long. The house, which had once represented a gift, a gesture of maternal love and sacrifice, had now become a symbol of erasure, of manipulation, of how easily my years of devotion could be brushed aside in favor of appearances and status. And if Ethan was willing to cut me out without even a conversation, then I owed it to myself to ensure that I didn't become the footnote he had planned for me to be. I began compiling every receipt, every email, every transfer I had made to help with the down payment, every proof of contribution, and while doing so I stumbled upon a forgotten notebook filled with renovation notes and sketches I had made during those first few weeks after he bought the house. Ideas for repainting the living room, reorganizing the kitchen, creating a guest space where I could someday stay during holidays. And each page reminded me just how involved I had been, not just financially but emotionally, how invested I was in his future in that home, and the betrayal cut deeper with each page. Until the resolve burned so hot in my chest I knew there was no turning back. I told no one of my plan at first, not even Teresa, because I needed this to be mine, something I built with my own hands, something that no one else could take credit for or talk me out of, and every day became a quiet mission. I learned about liens, about property leverage, about how to initiate a legal purchase in cases of contested ownership, and as I dug deeper I discovered that the mortgage, while legally tied to Ethan, was still vulnerable due to the dual nature of the original contract, meaning if I paid the remainder outright I could petition for sole ownership, especially if I could prove intent and financial history. It wasn't just about buying the house back. It was about reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped from me in whispers, in dismissals, in signatures made behind my back, and so I met with a financial advisor, drained what was left of my savings, moved around some retirement investments. And when the numbers still fell short, I did something I never thought I'd do. I contacted an old coworker from my janitorial days who now ran a small cleaning service, and I asked if she had any work, and without a second thought she said yes, and just like that I was back to mopping floors at night, not because I had to, but because I chose to, because I was building something with every swipe of the mop, every bag of trash I carried out, every minute I spent remembering the woman I used to be, the one who could do anything for her son and now finally was doing something for herself. And when I wasn't working or researching or filing paperwork, I was learning how to navigate the real estate market like a woman on a mission. I studied zoning laws, property tax codes, transfer regulations, and I took notes like I was preparing for the exam of my life, because in many ways I was. And the most surreal moment came when I sat across from a banker, a man who looked at me with polite detachment until I handed him the documents and explained my plan, and something in his expression shifted as he said, "This is impressive." And for the first time in years I felt respected. Not as someone's mother, not as a grieving woman, but as a person in full control of her destiny. And slowly, piece by piece, the plan came together. I would finalize the purchase on January 26th, the exact date Ethan and I had signed the original agreement 2 years prior, and it would be symbolic, not just for me but for the woman I used to be, the one who gave and gave without expecting anything in return. Because this time I wasn't just giving, I was claiming, owning, asserting, and with every passing day as the legal steps fell into place and the funds were prepared, I felt myself growing taller, stronger, not in body but in spirit, as though each paper I signed was another piece of my soul being stitched back together. And though part of me still mourned the son I had lost, the bond we had shattered, I also knew that this journey wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about reclaiming myself. And by the time the morning of January 26th arrived, I stood at the doorstep of the very house I had once helped him buy, dressed not in bitterness but in quiet power, ready to walk through the door not as a victim, but as the rightful owner of my own story. The morning of January 26th arrived without ceremony. No birds chirping, no sun beaming through the clouds, just a low-hanging gray sky and a biting wind that stung my face as I stepped out of my car. The deed to the house clutched in my gloved hand like a talisman, the final piece of a long, painful journey that had begun with humiliation on Christmas and led me here, to this driveway, to this front porch where I had once watched Ethan carry boxes with excitement in his eyes and dreams in his heart. And as I stood before the door I had helped paint, my heart didn't pound with anger or revenge as I thought it might, but with a deep aching calm, the kind that comes when you've cried all your tears and made peace with the fact that nothing will ever be the same again. I rang the bell once, twice, and heard movement inside, the shuffle of feet, the click of a lock, and then there he was, my son, standing in the doorway wearing a sweatshirt and confusion on his face, his hair a mess and a coffee mug in his hand, and for a moment he looked like the boy I used to kiss goodnight, but that image shattered as soon as his eyes registered what I was holding, and I watched the blood drain from his face as he stepped aside and said, "What are you doing here, Mom?" in a tone that was more annoyance than concern. And I took a slow breath, stepping inside without waiting for permission because I didn't need it. Not today. And I handed him the envelope, the one with the legal notice, the one that confirmed what he never thought I'd have the strength or knowledge to do, that I had legally, quietly and fully assumed ownership of the home. And as he opened it and read, the silence between us stretched thick and heavy, the kind of silence that drowns out even the loudest thoughts. And when he finally looked up, eyes wide, mouth opening but unable to form words, I said calmly, "I know everything, Ethan. The documents, the quiet title claim, the meetings with Alana's father, all of it." And I watched as the mask fell from his face, replaced not with guilt but with disbelief, as if the possibility of me outmaneuvering him had never even crossed his mind, and he stammered, "Mom, it wasn't personal," to which I replied, "Of course it was. Because how could it be anything else when your child tries to erase you from the life you helped build?" And the words I'd rehearsed in my head all week began to flow, not with venom or volume but with the cold, clear precision of someone who has been hurt deeply and finally understands the power of boundaries. And I told him about the documents I found in the attic, about the lawyer, the advisor, the sleepless nights I spent trying to figure out how to protect what little I had left of myself. And as I spoke he just sat there, the mug forgotten in his hand, the shame starting to bloom in his expression like a slow dawn. And when he tried to interrupt with excuses, with deflections about how Alana's father said it was just business, and how they didn't think I'd even notice. I held up my hand and said, Don't insult me by pretending this was anything other than betrayal. And I saw then, in the way his shoulders slumped and his eyes dropped to the floor, that for the first time in this entire ordeal, he understood what he had done. Not just legally, not just financially, but emotionally, spiritually, in the deepest way possible. And when he finally whispered, "I didn't mean to hurt you," I replied, "But you did, Ethan, and I can't pretend that didn't happen." And for a long time neither of us spoke, and I looked around the room at the furniture I had helped move in, the curtains I had sewn by hand as a housewarming gift, the tiny potted plant in the window that I had bought on a whim during a shopping trip we took together before the world changed, and I felt both grief and relief in equal measure. Grief for the innocence we had lost, and relief that I was no longer waiting for him to give me the respect I now demanded from myself. And when I finally stood to leave, I looked him in the eye and said, "You have 1 week to move out. I'll give you that much because I'm still your mother." And as I walked toward the door he said quietly, "Mom, I don't know how to fix this." And I paused, my hand on the knob, and replied, "You start by understanding it's not yours to fix. This is mine now." And then I left, the cold air hitting my face like absolution as I stepped into the quiet morning, the house behind me no longer a symbol of loss but of reclamation. And as I drove away I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because for the first time in my life I knew exactly where I was going. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been before, not just empty of voices or footsteps, but heavy with the residue of what had been said, of what had changed. And as Ethan sat alone on the living room couch where he and Alana had once laughed and made plans, he found himself staring at the framed photograph on the mantel, the one he hadn't even noticed until that morning, a picture of him and his mother from his college graduation, her eyes swollen from tears, his arm casually slung around her shoulder. And for the first time in years he saw something in that photo he hadn't allowed himself to see before. The raw, unfiltered pride in her face, the exhaustion behind her smile, the way she had held on to him like he was her world. And he realized in that moment just how much he had taken for granted, how many times he had chosen convenience over kindness, pride over humility, and the silence around him now was like a mirror reflecting every unspoken apology, every opportunity missed, every time he rolled his eyes or shrugged off her love like it was something owed to him instead of the miracle that it was. And as he walked through the house, his mother's house now, he began to hear the echoes, not literal sounds, but memories layered into the walls, the kind that clung to every surface. The way she used to call his name up the stairs when dinner was ready, the late-night conversations they once had about dreams and heartbreaks and the future, the scent of her cooking that somehow still lingered in the corners of the kitchen. And for the first time he felt the crushing weight of what he had done, not just in trying to sell the house, but in how he had dismissed her, diminished her, reduced her years of sacrifice to something transactional. And though he had convinced himself it was about independence, about efficiency, about moving forward with Alana and building a life of his own, he now saw that it had been about ego, about proving he could stand on his own, not realizing that in pushing his mother away he had severed the one relationship that had truly grounded him. And it wasn't until Alana showed up that evening expecting to talk about their Aspen trip and future remodels, that the full impact hit him, because when he told her what had happened, that his mother now owned the house, that they needed to find somewhere else to live, her reaction wasn't shock or sympathy, but irritation, disbelief that he had let her win. And he saw in her eyes something he hadn't noticed before, or maybe something he had refused to see. The contempt, the subtle way she always made him feel like his background was something to be embarrassed about, the way she referred to his mom's traditions as quaint, and when she said, "Maybe it's time you cut the cord for real," he felt something inside him snap, not with rage, but with clarity, because in that moment he realized he had already cut the cord, and it had left him drifting, unmoored, a man who had traded love for status and found himself lonelier than ever. And so he told her to leave, not angrily but firmly, and when the door shut behind her the silence returned, but this time it felt different. It felt deserved, and as he sat alone in the dim light, he remembered being 6 years old, curled up on the couch with his head in his mother's lap, crying over a scraped knee, and how she had stroked his hair and said, "I'll always be here no matter what." And now, sitting in the same spot decades later, he felt the ache of that promise echoing in his bones, not because she had broken it, but because he had taken it for granted until it was no longer his to claim. And though he knew he couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't erase the sting of betrayal or the damage of his decisions, he also knew that healing would have to begin with him, with owning the pain he caused, with acknowledging the depth of what he had lost. And as he wandered from room to room that night, touching the walls like they might speak to him, he understood that this house was never just a building. It was a vessel of love, of sacrifice, of history etched into every nail and floorboard. And he was the one who had treated it like a transaction, and now he would have to learn how to live with that truth, to sit in the quiet and let the echoes of his mother's love remind him of who he used to be, and who he still had the chance to become, if only he could find the courage to change. That it didn't happen in a grand moment or with any dramatic gesture. There was no knock on the door in the rain, no handwritten letter slipped under a welcome mat. Redemption for Ethan began in the small, unglamorous choices, like picking up the phone one morning 2 weeks after he had moved out, his hands shaking as he dialed the number he had called 1,000 times before but that now felt like the most uncertain line in the world. And when it rang just once before going to voicemail, he didn't hang up. Instead, he left a message, voice low and trembling, saying simply, "Mom, I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to try. I miss you." And those words, quiet and imperfect, marked the first true step on a road he didn't know how to walk but was now committed to finding his way through. And on the other side of that message, Helen sat alone in her kitchen, phone still in her hand long after the voicemail ended, her heart caught between the warmth of hearing her son's voice and the ache of all that had come before. And she didn't call him back right away, not out of cruelty, but because she needed to be sure that his effort wasn't just an impulse, a moment of guilt, but something deeper, something real. And in the days that followed, he didn't give up, didn't retreat when she didn't respond immediately. Instead, he showed up quietly in ways that didn't demand attention, like sending a handwritten letter through the mail. Instead of texting, a letter that said, "I see now how blind I was to your love," and volunteering at the local shelter where she once worked part-time to make ends meet, humbling himself without telling anyone, not even her, just to begin rediscovering what it meant to give without expecting something back. And little by little, those actions started to build a bridge, not one wide enough to cross just yet, but enough for Helen to begin walking toward the idea of forgiveness. Slowly, cautiously, the way someone who's been burned learns to reach for warmth again. And when they finally met, at a coffee shop neither of them had ever been to, neutral ground, there was no dramatic reunion, just a quiet moment where Ethan stood awkwardly beside the table, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, and Helen looked up from her tea and gave the smallest of nods, and he sat down without speaking, letting the silence fill the space between them, not as a wall but as something sacred. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't with rehearsed lines or excuses but with a simple, broken truth. "I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I was growing up, but I was just pushing you away because I was ashamed of needing you." And that truth, raw and unvarnished, opened something in Helen, not because it erased the pain but because it named it. And they talked, not about property or money or legal deeds, but about childhood, about the night he failed a math test and she stayed up with him until morning, about how he used to sneak into her bed after nightmares, about how she used to write notes in his lunchbox that he pretended to be embarrassed by but secretly kept in his desk drawer all through high school. And those memories, those shared moments of joy and struggle, became the beginning of something new, not a return to what they were but a path to what they could become. And though it was slow, like learning how to trust your legs after a long injury, it was real. And in the months that followed, they kept meeting, sometimes for tea, sometimes for walks in the park, sometimes in complete silence. And while Helen didn't open her home back to him, she did open her heart inch by inch as she saw the man he was becoming, a man shaped by the lessons he had learned through pain, a man who no longer saw her as a stepping stone but as a foundation he had once taken for granted and now deeply respected. And in those small, ordinary moments they began to rebuild. Not a perfect bond, not one untouched by cracks, but one fortified by truth and accountability. And for the first time in a long time, Helen smiled, not because everything was healed, but because healing had finally begun. That there's a kind of love that doesn't shout or shine, doesn't come wrapped in grand gestures or tidy resolutions. It's the kind that endures in silence, that holds steady even when it's been bruised, tested, redefined, and rebuilt. And as Helen sat one afternoon in the newly repainted living room of the house she now fully called her own, sipping tea while the sun streamed softly through the window panes she had scrubbed herself, she thought about all the ways her love for Ethan had changed, not disappeared, but grown quieter, wiser, less dependent on reciprocation and more rooted in acceptance. And she realized that what remained between them wasn't what once was. It wasn't the wide-eyed adoration of a little boy or the fierce protectiveness of a single mother. But something more mature, more measured, like a weathered oak tree that had withstood years of storms and still stood tall, not untouched but undeniably strong. And she saw it in the way Ethan now showed up. Not every day, not perfectly, but consistently in the small things like replacing her leaky kitchen faucet without her asking, or calling just to check if she'd remembered to schedule her doctor's appointment. And while he never moved back into the house by his own choice, he became present. In a way he hadn't been in years, helping with the garden on weekends, bringing over leftovers he'd cooked himself, sitting on the porch with her in long stretches of companionable silence that no longer felt strained but sacred. And in those moments Helen saw flashes of the boy she had raised, the one with scraped knees and wide eyes who once said, "I want to grow up and take care of you, Mama." And while that promise had been forgotten in the rush of adulthood, it seemed, in these quiet acts, to be finding its way back to life. And yet, despite this slow mending, Helen never forgot what had happened, never erased the pain or tried to rewrite the past as something less hurtful than it had been, because the truth mattered and love without truth was just sentiment. But what she chose to do was hold both the hurt and the healing in the same hand, letting one inform the other, and in doing so, she discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed. Not just the strength to survive, but to set boundaries without guilt, to say no without apology, to love without losing herself. And for Ethan, the journey wasn't easy either. There were days he still wrestled with guilt, still remembered the look in her eyes that morning on the porch, and though she had never thrown it back at him, he carried it as a reminder, not a punishment but a guide, and it led him to start volunteering more often, to speak kindly of her when others brought up their past, to listen instead of defend when she shared her feelings. And in those choices he found a version of himself that he could respect, not the man who had once tried to erase his mother from his life, but the man who now honored her place in it. And together they began creating new memories. Meals cooked side by side, laughter over old stories, gentle teasing about her ever-growing collection of ceramic birds, and these moments didn't erase what had been lost, but they offered something else. Proof that love, real love, can evolve, can be battered and broken and still find a way to breathe. And as Helen sat watching Ethan play cards with a neighbor's child on the living room floor, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that blooms when you know you've faced the worst and found your way through. And she knew then that while the roles between mother and son had shifted, the love had never truly left, it had only changed its shape. And what remained now was something deeper, more rooted and enduring in its quiet, steady presence. Christmas came again as it always does, but this time it was different. Not because of the decorations, though Helen had strung up a few lights around the porch railing and placed a small tree in the corner of the living room, but because of the air that filled the house, warm and soft, free of tension, thick with something unspoken yet fully present. A quiet reverence for everything that had been lost, faced and found in the year gone by. And as Helen stood in the kitchen stirring gravy in the same pot she'd used for decades, she looked out into the living room where Ethan sat on the couch, cross-legged and focused, carefully assembling a puzzle they'd picked out together at the market the week before. And something about the way the pieces clicked into place seemed symbolic. Like a gentle echo of the rebuilding they'd done, one conversation, one quiet act at a time. And while the memory of the previous Christmas still lived inside them, sharp, painful, unforgettable, it no longer had the power to define them, because what they had forged since then had grown strong enough to hold both the heartbreak and the healing without breaking apart. There were no guests, no parties, no elaborate brunches or gifts wrapped in gold foil. Just a simple meal, laughter shared over old photo albums, a few candles flickering on the table, and a sense of gratitude so deep it brought tears to Helen's eyes when she paused to take it all in. Because for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a background character in her own life, didn't feel like she was clinging to someone who had outgrown her. She felt whole, seen, and standing in her own home, the deed now tucked away in a drawer not as a trophy but as a testament to her journey. She felt peace settle into her bones in a way it never had before, and when Ethan looked up from the puzzle and caught her eye, he smiled, not the sheepish smile of someone seeking forgiveness, but the warm, steady smile of someone who had found his way home. And it made her chest tighten with something tender. because that smile told her that while the road had been long, they had both arrived at something true. And later, as they sipped tea by the fireplace and watched the snow begin to fall outside, Ethan reached into a small paper bag and pulled out a frame, not fancy, not store-bought, just wood he had sanded himself. And inside it was a picture of the two of them from the coffee shop where they had begun again, his arm loosely draped around her shoulder, her eyes laughing, and at the bottom in his handwriting were the words, "Thank you for still being here." And for a moment neither of them spoke, but the silence between them wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with understanding, with a love that had been tested and proven true. And as Helen reached out to take his hand, her voice shook as she whispered, "I always will be." And he nodded, swallowing hard, and together they sat in the quiet, the flicker of the fire painting soft shadows on the walls, and the house, her house, felt alive again, not with the echo of what once was, but with the presence of what had finally become. And in that gentle, glowing moment, Christmas came not as a celebration of perfection or tradition, but as a testament to endurance, to grace, and to the kind of love that stays, not because it never faltered but because it chose again and again to come back.